Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our Rules of Conduct workshop for this new stakeholder process. My name is Brenda Corona, representing the Stakeholder Affairs Group at the California ISO. We welcome you on this morning for a workshop that will have a lot of information. But before we get started, I want to go a few meeting reminders. As today, this call is being recorded for informational and convenience purposes only. Any related transcription should not be reprinted without the ISO's permission. If you do experience any technical issues, Candice will be available through the chat as well as myself. And then also for the duration of this workshop, we would like to remind you everyone to keep comments short and brief so that way we can go through each slide in the meeting. As well, we are welcoming all questions in the raise hand icon that's located in the middle of your screen. This icon will let us know that you have a question. Please make sure you provide your name and state your affiliation before stating your comment. And those who are logged in through audio only, please use the #2 on your device so we can know you have a question. As now we're going to go ahead and review the agenda for today. As today's agenda, we will have a introductory remarks from Milos, and then he'll hand it off to Dinesh to go over the initiative background and timeline. Next, he'll pass it on to David to go into initial ROC topics and potential changes. Around 10:25, we will target a short break. And then from there, we will go into a stakeholder discussion to go over the initiative scope. And that will be facilitated by Dinesh and a few others. As well, for the 11 o'clock time frame, we will do a discussion on the topic tracked or categorization. And then that will be the last topic for today's workshop. And then we'll end our discussion workshop for the next steps with myself. But now I would go ahead and invite Milos to be unmuted, and we will go ahead and give him the floor for the next few slides. Milos?
Thank you, Brenda, and good morning, everybody. Hopefully you can hear me okay. Thank you again for taking the time and joining us today on this new initiative. Today, we're launching a new effort to review and potentially enhance a number of aspects and items related to the rules of conduct that you'll hear about later today, primarily associated with late submissions of meter data and the subsequent accrual penalties, but we'll also touch on other aspects of rules of conduct as we walk through the different potential areas of change. These rules of conduct, which are described in the tariff, have the role of preventing market manipulation, anti-competitive behavior in the market in different contexts. And for example, in the context of meter data penalties that apply as a result of conduct violations, these incent timely submission of meter data to support timely and accurate market settlement. These rules of conduct, as well in the context of meter data submissions, but in other aspects as well, apply to both the ISO balancing area, where we operate the day-ahead and the real-time markets, but it also applies across the wider market footprint, including the EIM, where we have extended the real-time market. And therefore, EIM entities also, as they join, they have the same expectation and obligation to provide timely meter data and also abide by different rules of conduct that are laid out in the tariff. More recently, just to give you an example, when meter data penalties have accrued, the ISO has pursued a number of FERC waivers under different circumstances, seeking the ability to waive the application of these rules of conduct and consequently waive sizable penalties that have accrued, in part due to disproportionality of the penalty and the magnitude of the data error. But there have been other contexts as well. And these waivers have supported both the ISO balancing area entities' accrued penalties, but also waiver of EIM entity penalties that have accrued as well. And FERC has encouraged us, the ISO, to review these rules of conduct, particularly associated with meter data penalties, to further consider clarifications on enhancements to limit or avoid continued reliance on waiver requests of these rules and associated penalties, and provide further clarity in that design. Rules of conduct enhancements, particularly related to these meter data penalties, have also been part of the policy catalog and the roadmap process, where a number of stakeholders over the last couple of years in particular have raised have requested that the ISO create a forum to discuss particularly meter data penalty rules of conduct enhancements. With these two factors in mind, the FERC request for us to review the rules and decrease dependence on waiver filings, as well as the desire from a number of stakeholders that have requested that meter data penalty rules of conduct be reviewed, we're starting this rules of conduct enhancements initiative with the workshop today to create awareness on a number of topics that we think warrant review and discussion regarding these rules of conduct. And we have left space today, certainly, for a dialogue on the different elements that we have identified for further vetting, but we also want to hear from you on those elements that we raised today, but also other elements that you think maybe should be considered based on your experience over the years in this area regarding rules of conduct. We want to encourage today to be a dialogue that will ultimately further shape the scope of this effort as we start with the workshop today. With that context, please let me turn it over to Dinesh, who's our policy lead on the effort. He recently joined our policy team and has been leading the internal discussions on this topic, and he will help facilitate the rest of today's meeting. So Dinesh, I'll turn it over to you.
Hi, excuse me. Hi, good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for the introductory remarks, Milos. My name is Dinesh, and I did recently join the ISO after finishing a master's in public policy from the University of Chicago. I'm very excited to be collaborating and learning from you, the stakeholder community, while we work on this, my first initial initiative here. Brendan, next slide, please. Okay. So just a little bit of background about what we are talking about here and what where this initiative is going. So the rules of conduct provide market rules and penalties for non-compliance with the ISO tariff. They aim to provide fair notice of ISO rules, create a fair and equal market environment, redress market manipulation and anti-competitive behavior, and foster confidence in CAISO's markets. Importantly, the rules of conduct provide objective guidance. Any subjective interpretations and penalties, including waivers to the tariff, are under the purview of FERC. So with meter data penalties, recently we've made that request to FERC to waive the penalties for certain participants. This version of the rules of conduct originated after the California energy crisis in order to prevent future market manipulation from participants. This was back in 2004. Specifically, meter data penalties were updated to the current per-day penalties in 2011 from a percentage-based penalty to a per-day penalty. Many aspects of the rules of conduct have not been recently updated, and I'm very excited to be learning from stakeholders about how we can further enhance the rules of conduct. Next slide, please. We are considering at least 2 tracks for this initiative. Currently, we have 9 topics that we are considering, one of which is meter data penalties. So for track 1, we are hoping to include items that can afford to have a more streamlined stakeholder process and balance with the urgency of the items in discussion. We hope to implement these changes by December of 2023. For track 2, we are hoping to engage more deeply with you all, the stakeholder community, and we are also hoping to have a wider scope and be able to include many more items than we can in the track 1 process. This track will tentatively be launched in late July, and this is pending both internal and external stakeholder input. For this initiative, I'm hoping that we can treat each other with respect, maintain transparency, and also maintain iterative feedback so we can make the best rules of conduct that we can possibly make. Next slide, please. So specifically, this is a track 1 timeline. The track 2 timeline will be announced at a future date once everything is a little bit more settled. So to note, we are trying to make implementation by December 2023, which means that we will need to go to the Joint ISO Board of Governors and WEIM governing body meeting in September. What this means is, for the stakeholder process, is we will have a straw proposal and a draft final proposal, but we do not plan to launch an issue paper. We are hoping that through the verbal discussion today and the written comments that we will receive from stakeholders, that we will be able to identify the issues that we would like to address for track one, and then combine that with the straw proposal paper posted on July 5th. Okay, Brenda? Any questions, any concerns, any ideas that have come up so far?
As a reminder for those on the phone, feel free to press #2, or for those who are logged in through the WebEx, please press the raise hand icon above your chat window. And Candace, do we have any questions in the queue?
Not at this time.
I will now be passing this off to David, David Zlotlow, who will be walking us through the 9 topics we have on the agenda.
Okay, hey, good morning, everyone. So y'all can hear me okay still? Just to check that before I go off and talk for about 40, 50 minutes on this. Thumbs up. Okay, fantastic. Okay, well, we can go to the next slide, and then, you know, what we're going to do right now, or what I'm going to do in the next however much time this takes, is to go through, I think there's about 9 items that we've sort of identified as initial changes that might be in scope. And I'll just briefly kind of run through them, and then, you know, we'll have pause for some clarifying questions. But what we're going to try to do is sort of the more open discussion of, you know, is this change right, wrong? Is the track recommendation right or wrong? You know, or you have feedback on that. You know, I think we're going to plan to have that for later in the call, but it's just really, if it's clarifying questions now, I think we'd like to take those as I go through each of the topics. And then if it's more of, you know, we think this is wrong, we think penalty should be X dollars instead of Y dollars, you know, that sort of stuff. I think that's meant to be more for later in the program when we have kind of open dialogue on sort of whether these are the right changes. So that's what I wanted to say in introduction to this. So like I said, we'll go through these sort of, I think it's 9 topics that we've identified as potential to include, you know, and then I think there might be others that join into this process later on based on your feedback, or, you know, based on new things that come up. So this isn't meant to be comprehensive, and it's not meant to, you know, be the only thing only list of things we're going to talk about here. But, you know, this is what we have for now to start the conversation on this initiative. So with that, we'll dive in. The meter data penalties, that's sort of why we're here, really, the impetus for having this large initiative, which I think is going to be really beneficial overall for all Section 37, the rules of conduct. But we start with the meter data penalties, as Milos was talking about. There's some history here with some FERC waivers and so on. And so real quick, the current rule is both late and inaccurate meter data submissions are subject to a penalty of $1,000 per trading day. Going back about 10 or so years, the penalty had been different. It was based on a percent of the value of the error. It was 30% of the value of the error if it was self-reported by the scheduling coordinator, 70% if it was identified by the California ISO. I think in practice there was never the 70% error. You know, that never, I think, in practice ever actually applied. It was really always 30%, because it's, you know, when you think about it, it's rather difficult for the ISO to even identify errors in self-reported meter data. You know, there have to be huge discrepancies generally for that to even be something that would have risen to our attention. But anyway, so we found that the 30% value could lead to excessive penalties in cases where there was you know, maybe a small process error that was magnified over a large base, a large amount of load, the penalties could run into millions of dollars. So we thought a more appropriate approach would be to have $1,000 trading day, just sort of a flat penalty, simplify matters, and then just sort of say, that seems like it's good. It's sort of a good sort of penalty to sort of send a message that you should be doing this, but it's not going to be onerous. It's not going to lead into excessive penalties. And that was true for the scenario we were thinking about. We did not really consider the opposite scenario, which has come up multiple times now, where it's a very small error that lasts over a lot of trading days, where $1,000 a day magnified over, hundreds of trading days for an error that could be just fractions of a megawatt or megawatt or something like that, then it can create the opposite problem where it's excessive penalties for a small but long-lasting penalty. So that's been the source of quite a few of the recent waivers. So we do think it's important to look at that and possibly change the penalty. The initial change we thought made sense, and this is something we'll talk about more, is make it the lower of 30% of the error or $1,000 per trading day. And then so it sort of kind of meets both needs. So if it's 30% of the value of the error for those long-lasting but very small megawatt errors, then the penalty would be appropriately small because it's based on the magnitude of the error. Where you have something like a very large load-serving entity with some small process error that shifted their load data by a couple percent or something, but it just creates a large dollar value to the change, then it's sort of limited by that $1,000 per trading day. So I do see in the chat, there was a question, how would the 30% value of the error be calculated? That's just, megawatts times price, essentially, that whatever the misreported, so let's say you reported 100 megawatts initially, and then after the deadline for revisions, you say, no, actually it was 110 megawatts instead of 100 megawatts, so that's a 10 megawatt difference, 10 megawatts times the price, and I don't remember if it was maybe like an average price over the time period. I don't believe that there was, well, actually these penalties go back before we even had a nodal market, so the details in that tariff provision might not have even been 100% applicable to the current market design, but it was basically the number of megawatts at issue times the price. And it might have, like I said, it might have been an average price or something like that. But that's one clarifying question I just saw come in the chat. And then a further question was that megawatt times price for the generator meter netted from the megawatt times price for the load meter. So I'll answer this way, that it was the megawatts changing for the scheduling coordinator. So maybe that answers the question. It wasn't necessarily per, so if we have a scheduling coordinator that's reporting generator meter and load meters, it's not assessed separately. It's scheduling coordinator reports, one value for its meter data, and then if that's changing. So, and I don't know if, and another wrinkle of this would be that generators typically are SC metered entities where the ISO is pulling the meters directly. It's generally load that is self-reporting the data as a SC metered entity. So that's, that might not practically apply in this scenario. And then another question, a lot of questions coming in the chat, which is helpful. I'll just go through them real quick. Another question was 30% calculation be included in the language for clarity. If that's a question about included in the eventual tariff language, of course, if it was a question of more clarity as we go through the stakeholder process, I think the answer to that is also yes. As we flesh this out, as we kind of start landing on more concrete options, yeah, sure, we'll add more clarity as we go. And then another question came in, is there a consideration that this would apply just to underreporting of load, overreporting of generation? So the idea there is the market harm is if a load serving entity underreports load because then it paid, too little, or overreported generation because then the generator was initially paid too much. So then the question was, should we limit the penalties only to where there was a market harm, with the idea that if it's a load serving entity that overreported load or a generator that underreported generation, that metering error, they already harmed themselves by the error. Why should we additionally penalize them as well? I assume that's sort of the rationale. That is, that could be something we talk about. Yeah, sure. That maybe there's a rationale for that. I think the counter argument would be the penalties are here to really drive correct and accurate settlement information and, get the correct data on time so that the settlements process can continue kind of churning along, because, we have new settlement process for every trading day and we kind of have to keep things on schedule. So I think the counter argument to limiting the penalties where there's a market harm would be, in a sense, there is a notion of market harm, even if the individual scheduling coordinator reported data that was to their detriment. It's still, if we're going to take the new data and rerun it through the settlement process, then the fact that we have to rerun the numbers itself is a form of market harm. So that would be the counter argument there. But again, something we can talk about as we move forward. So one more question coming in, and I sort of said we would try to limit this to clarifying questions, and I'm breaking my own rule by kind of starting to get into the details. But I'll just read this question out, and maybe I'll give a 10-second answer, and we can kind of add it to the queue for more detailed conversation later. Question, should there be consideration given to the cause of the error and the entity that should be charged? I'd say today there isn't, and my thought would be delving into the cause of the error is not feasible because of the direction we've gotten from FERC that, these have to be for objectively identifiable violations. So the idea, and just you'll hear this term maybe sometimes, in some instances, FERC has referred to these as traffic ticket penalties. And the idea is it's just for really objectively identifiable things like, you parked on the street, your meter expired, the person giving you the ticket isn't really going to listen to why you were 5 minutes late and putting more money in the meter. It's just sort of a black and white sort of thing. That's the approach that FERC has told us we're supposed to take. So delving into the cause of the error would be really hard to do consistent with that guidance. The respective entity, so I presume, and what we've had in some instances with the meter data penalties already is sometimes, for example, say like a demand response provider, sometimes they're reporting data to the ISO directly, but the data they report to us is something that they have to get from, say, an incumbent utility. So, they can say, well, yeah, ISO, we reported the data to you late, or we made a correction after the allowable deadline for corrections, but really it's because the load serving entity gave us new data, and that's not our fault. You shouldn't penalize us. So that is a scenario that we're aware of. There is some existing provisions in Section 37 about that. That we did not have that listed in any of the slides, but maybe that's a more general principle to also revisit here, is this idea that if you can show that it was totally the fault of another entity, if they're an ISO scheduling coordinator as well, then there's ability to shift the penalties. That, as far as I know, has not really happened. I think maybe those are provisions that we should revisit. Those would be difficult to. I think it would be difficult to implement. I mean, it's existing tariff. We would figure it out, but yeah. So hopefully that answers some of those questions. Finally, it is for all BAAs submitting meter data, KISO or KISO's internal LSCs. This is for all scheduling coordinators reporting meter data to the ISO. So this is, applicable to WEIM entities as well if they're reporting meter data, which certainly some of them are. So with that, I see I've been focusing on chat questions. If there's any questions queued up on the phone, we should take those now. I don't want to just answer the chat questions. So if anyone's waiting on the phone, please queue up.
Sounds great, David. So we can go ahead and have Mike McGuffin from CES go first. And reminder for everyone, these are clarifying questions only. We will have time later on to ask questions for the actual topic. So if you can be brief, and that would be great. Thanks. Go ahead, Mike.
Okay, there we go. Sorry, I was having trouble going back. Well, first off, welcome, Dinesh. Welcome to the Sausage Making Club.
Thank you.
And I think I don't have a specific question on the proposed policies at this point, but just being involved in this process for as long as I have, I feel like I need to plead the fifth, but I think everybody's run across something, some sort of issue in their time participating in the market, and having the enforcement protocols residing in the tariff has always been a restricting issue for the ISO because seemingly meaningless error. I know the ISO doesn't make errors, so it's hard for you guys to understand our side, but sometimes errors happen and innocent mistakes happen. But having the protocols in the tariff makes it extremely difficult and unlikely that the ISO will grant a waiver regardless of the reasoning. And so I would suggest that if possible, have language in the tariff that discusses EP penalties, but with the bulk of the authority granted to the ISO to in the BPMs, so it provides you with the flexibility to make some of these calls and determine errors of magnitude, or provide maybe you get 2 get out of jail free cards a year on a particular issue, or whatever the solution ends up being. But I think just taking that not making it so that you do not have to file with FERC every time there's a waiver of a penalty. It can still be made public somehow if that's of concern. But that would be my biggest suggestion here. Just give yourself the flexibility to make decisions and and not have it so rigid as it is today. Because I think most mistakes, most people will agree, are systematic, and to some extent, some of the mistakes are fairly small. So yeah, that's my only feedback, and I don't have any specific feedback on the individual issues, but I hope you guys take that approach. So thank you.
Okay, yeah, well, we can bring that up in more of the open discussion later. I think, it would be hard to, I don't know that FERC would let us take that approach, but, we could see, I mean, maybe their views have evolved over the last 10 years or so in terms of how much discretion they're prepared to afford an ISO RTO in enforcing these penalties. But, I think when we last went through this, seemed pretty clear they would not permit that approach. But maybe things have changed. Maybe we could come up with a good case for that. But we'll talk about that more later. I think that's an important point you're raising, that sort of that applies to all of these, not just the meter data penalties, but all of the things. So we'll bring that up later. And finally, I think there's a chat question. What about a warning for the first infraction for a different time period? Maybe we'll get into that in a moment, actually, for one of the other ones. So I see Lindsay from NB Energy with hand raised. Maybe we can take that comment.
Hi, yes, and I don't have a clarifying question. I'm sorry about that. I just wanted to say thank you for taking up this initiative and starting this stakeholder process for this. We believe that the penalties should not be overly punitive, so we're definitely supporting the direction in this initiative. So thank you.
Okay, well, that's we like that feedback, so that's good. Do we have any other questions queued up? Like I said before, we're trying to keep this more clarifying questions at this point before we get into more of the, alternative approaches and so on. But we are keeping track of all these questions that come up, and we'll kind of bring them back later in this call.
Questions at this time. Thanks.
Okay. Well, we'll then move on to the next one. Go to the next slide, please. Okay. So this next topic, Section 37.9.4 talks about the ISO assesses penalties over the course of a calendar year and then distributes them to the market participants who didn't have a penalty in that year. There's a process in the tariff that requires us to first file with FERC before we distribute the funds. When I looked at the record from the initial creation of the rules of conduct, I believe part of that structure was put in place with the concern that, some stakeholders at that time were a little concerned about how would the ISO be, have an incentive to start running up penalties to sort of, for whatever reason, because initially I think the penalties were going to be an offset to GMC, and then there was, a concern there that, well, hey, the ISO might have an incentive to run up the penalties. So then I think there was a provision put in to say, well, FERC will approve the distribution before anything happens, so there's more visibility over that. And then I think the process evolved to what we have, where it's a distribution to the parties that did not have a penalty. So that whole notion of offset to GMC and whether there were mixed motives for the ISO enforcing this, I think that really dropped off the conversation. But and my memory of the history of that may be wrong, but I think that's sort of how this got here in terms of FERC needing to approve the distribution before we make it. I think over time, as we've kind of made this into a more routine thing, honestly, it's just kind of an administrative burden for the ISO to have to get FERC approval prior to the distribution. I think, there's a case, and I'm making it, that it's really a settlement function. It's a pretty basic pro rata allocation. It's pro rata by the grid management charge paid of the entities that did not have a penalty. So it's a pretty simple pro rata allocation. We, in our normal settlement processes that we do for every trading day, there's much more complicated calculations that happen every day. And so, I think there's questions about a market participant having the ability to appeal its penalty, and that's, that's a different topic. But once each of the individual penalty issues have been sorted out, and if the folks appeal to FERC, they don't appeal to FERC, once it's finalized, the money's collected, at that point, it's sort of a basic market settlement process. And so question is, what is the reason for needing a FERC approval before distributing the funds? And so the potential change would be to remove that requirement, let it be a normal settlement allocation, and then if there's, for example, a glitch in the allocation, then we can just redo it through the normal recalculation settlement process. So it wouldn't be a requirement to get FERC approval prior to distribution, and it would not hold up the distribution because then, of course, we have to make a filing, we have to wait for FERC to approve it, and I think the reality is sometimes maybe isn't the highest priority topic at FERC. I won't speak for them, but I'm just guessing that it might linger a little bit. And so it's a holdup where parties are due the money. It's sort of why create unnecessary holdups. And so that's the rationale of why we would look at this change. What we would do is have some kind of informational report, either filed with FERC or posted on our website. So I think parties, reasonably could say, well, we would still appreciate the transparency over what are the categories of penalties that are accruing over this year, how many, separate instances of meter data penalties accrued, how many this, that, and the other thing. Yeah, I mean, we can see why there'd be value in having that transparency. So we would still have some kind of informational report, either filed with FERC or posted on our website or something. So the content that is presented to FERC would be still presented to the market so you can see that. It would just not require prior FERC approval before we distribute the funds to the entities who are owed it. So that's the second topic we have. Are there any clarifying questions? We can take those now.
We have someone in the queue.
Bosco from Puget Sound. I have two questions. One is, when you say the market participants, is that all market participants or just market participants that have submit meter data, or just LSCs or just SCs?
No. So we the first slide was about meter data penalties, but that's one among many categories of rules of conduct penalties that can potentially be assessed. So it's the allocation is pro rata by grid management charge paid. So it's all basically all, and then some of the later slides are getting into exactly who should be eligible for that, who should be ineligible. But effectively, if you're paying grid management charge, you'd be eligible if you made it through the year without a penalty.
And follow up to that is, do you know offhand what percentage of market participants would be eligible for the distribution from the escrow?
I don't. I mean, I think now that I'm thinking about it, you could probably, we make the annual FERC filing. If we pulled all the filings from recent years, I think you could probably sort of tell, how many different, you would be able to tell how many different penalty events happened over the relevant calendar year. And then it's of course, like I said, it's pro rata by GMC. So, if it's a large entity that happens to be disqualified, then that can shift the allocation significantly also, whereas if it's like, smaller entity, that won't shift the allocation, one way or the other much. But I guess really the question is, in an average calendar year, how many different entities are subject to penalties? I guess that's probably really your question.
Basically, I'm just asking, like, how many entity, if there are 1,000, let's just say there's 1,000 entities that are eligible for in the ISO, but 800 of them had penalties, so only 200 were actually able to get payment. So you'd have a 20% payout. 20% of the entities would get payout. That's what I was trying to get at.
Yeah, I get that. I don't know that offhand. I do think if from the filings we made from recent years, that probably is answerable from that information already. I don't know that off the top of my head.
I was just wondering if you had that, available. It was just a curiosity question.
Yeah, I don't, but it's answerable with a little bit of homework. Okay, so yeah, it's like I said, it's something that can be determined. I don't know it off the top of my head. Okay, do we have any other questions on the second topic?
No questions at this time.
Okay, well then we can move to the next slide, please. Okay. So this next one is about the rules of conduct process of how we go about potentially enforcing a penalty. So the process will kick off if there's some reason to believe that potential violation occurred. So talked a lot about meter data. I'll pick a different example. So let's say resource adequacy plans are due by a certain date for a monthly RA process. And then this example really wouldn't apply for the WEIM entities, so stay with me on that. But for internal ISO entities, at least the example of the RA plans is due by a certain date. If it's late by a few days, then that would trigger a flag. Then it would start the rules of conduct enforcement process. And then in the business practice manual for rules of conduct processes, laid out in more detail. There's some detail in the tariff and then more detail in the BPM. So we go through a three-letter process where there's a lot of opportunity for the market participant to provide information to the ISO describing what happened, sort of to provide exculpatory factors, say, hey, it happened, but here's why it happened. It really wasn't, it was a harmless error, or it was, a small mix-up, but it really, we weren't trying to do anything bad, so please keep that in mind and all that. So there can be an extended sort of back and forth process, a lot of information flowing. The problem here is, like we said before, the expectation we got from FERC from the prior orders was that it is supposed to be for objectively identified information, subjectively identified violations. It's really supposed to be black and white. It's a matter of tariff implementation. You have to apply the penalties if they're owed. Going to one of the comments a few minutes ago about the really lack of discretion on the ISO's part. So what this is getting at is the existing process, I think sometimes creates some false expectations from market participants about what discretion the ISO can exercise here, which, like I said, there isn't much. And so having this detailed back and forth process, it gives, the market participants the opportunity to be heard, but if the ISO doesn't really have much discretion to do anything with that information, like I said, it can kind of maybe raise some false hopes about what the outcome will be. And it's kind of a, it's a process that's not really going to change the ultimate outcome should we be investing the time and energy into that if it's not really informing the final outcome. And so the proposal here is to streamline that process. One option, like we say here, is shift the process into the settlements dispute process. So, not saying that's what we're going to do, but for example, there in the normal settlements process, any entity can say, hey, ISO, I think you calculated this charge wrong. Please look at it. You have the opportunity to explain why it's wrong. We have staff who look into it and say, yeah, we agree, yeah, we disagree. And then, there's opportunities to pursue it beyond just the settlement dispute process if you, as a market participant, really think the ISO got it wrong. So we think that model might be a good way to go in terms of, for meter data, for example, really the question is, was the data submitted after the deadline? Did you have a revision after the deadline, or did you, fail to submit something by the deadline? That's a pretty black and white thing, and it seems like that is amenable to something like the existing settlements dispute process, where, the kind of issues that come up where we start a rules of conduct process and then drop it because we realize there was no violation, that does happen, just so you know. It would be things like, basically, we think, an entity did not submit required data on time, and they say, no, we did submit it. You missed it. Here's the email where we sent it to you. Here's a screenshot of when we uploaded the data to your, interface. And then we look at it, we go, oh, well, yeah, you're right. Maybe there was an error on our end. You've shown enough here to show, you did submit it. I guess, we can't pursue a penalty because there's, you're showing us something that says you did submit it. So things like that are the type of things where we say, okay, well, I guess we have to end the process here. We think there is a more streamlined way of getting there without kind of eating up months of time of back and forth. So that's the idea. We do have this as a recommendation for track 2 versus track 1. I think there would be, I assume, a lot of interest in, even if folks generally agree that it's a good principle to streamline the process, how we do that, I'm sure there would be a lot of different ideas. So we're not trying to do this one quickly, but it is something we think is worth discussing later on. So with that, I'll see if there's any comments queued up.
There are no questions in the verbal. Sorry, someone just raised their hand.
Okay.
Hi, this is Lim from PG&E. Just clarification, what you're talking about, the 3-letter process, are you specifically just talking about the meter submission component of it, or the entire compliance process, the 3-letter, that you're planning to move it to settlement dispute process?
Yeah, this is for all of the issues, not just meter data. It would be all of them. And I was saying settlement dispute process, that's an example. I mean, maybe it's not specifically that, but it's something to streamline it. So, but yeah, I see why you're saying if meter data is more clearly a settlement issue. So if I said settlement dispute process, I get to see how that might have been all confusing. But it would be for all of the categories, I think.
Okay. Thank you. I think like if it's all, there's a lot more, and some of it is, like you say, the meter submission is pretty clear, but there are other processes like telemetry, exemption, all go through the dispute process too, right? There's a lot more back and forth. I'm not sure whether would that work on the settlement dispute process. Just FYI. And
yeah, maybe that was an unrealistic hope, but yeah, I think the core idea is streamline it somehow. Maybe actually putting it in the settlement dispute process isn't going to work, or isn't going to work for all of them, but it's something along those lines is what we want to talk about.
yeah, got it. And that's where I think I was trying to get some clarification here. We'll talk about the, like you say, is it feasible or not later? But I was trying to get a little bit more clarification in terms of under this statement. It's all inclusive, right? You're trying to basically do away the 3-letter process.
That's what's on the table, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Okay, I don't see any more questions in the chat. Do you have any? I don't see any hands raised either.
David, there is a question in the chat.
Oh, okay. Oh, I see. Yeah. Okay. Does this change the responsibility to initiate dispute SC only, or can responsible generators also submit and manage their own dispute? I don't know. That would be Well, I guess I'll say, first of all, the penalty would still be assessed to the scheduling coordinator because that's sort of, how all the money flows. So I suppose if it's the question of we have a generator that is its own entity, but it's represented by an SC that's a third party SC, it's, totally different entity. And then the penalty is assessed because of something the generator did, but it's assessed to the SC. Would there be an opportunity for the generator separately from the SC to submit their dispute? Maybe. I think the problem would be, we want to, because at the end of the day, it's a dollar amount that's going to be charged or not charged. I think we want to maintain primary contact with the scheduling coordinator. But yeah, I don't know. Maybe there is a way to sort of add more ability to do that. That would be a question we could talk about more. Okay. I think we can move to the next slide. Okay. This next one is about demand response, and this is a little, it's definitely, if you're not a demand response provider, this is certainly a niche topic, but for a demand response provider, this could potentially be pretty important. There's a requirement in the tariff that demand response providers provide baseline data for demand response events. The rules are a little detailed, but basically you have to provide a certain number of days of baseline meter data, and that's sort of a way of measuring how much demand response was actually provided during the demand response event. And so that obligation is defined as being for each demand response resource, unlike the meter data penalties, which are defined as being on a overall scheduling coordinator basis. This is each individual demand response resource, and that's because the underlying obligation is for each resource to provide that baseline data. If there's a failure to do so, there's a generally applicable penalty in section 37.6.1 saying tariff required information that is late has a $500 a day penalty. And that's if there's not some other penalty. So for example, meter data, something we've talked about a lot, that has its own standalone provision. But if it's not something that is specifically called out, then it's an all-purpose $500 a day penalty. And so the question here is, for those demand response providers, that baseline data, is it effectively meter data? Is it close to meter data? Is it sort of all part of, really, in the end, kind of just part of the meter data submission process, and it's sort of a unique thing that demand response providers provide that other generation types don't? Yeah, there's an argument to be made there. And so really the question is, if that's the case, should the penalty be on a per scheduling coordinator basis rather than a per resource basis? The reason why this matters is because, to my understanding, is some of the demand response providers will, have a certain amount of demand response overall that they're able to provide, but in terms of how it's modeled, the ISO, maybe for contractual purposes or whatever, it's split up into a lot of different resource IDs, and that, like I said, my understanding is that sort of helps internal accounting, contracting purposes, whatever, for those entities, and that's all fine. But it's kind of like all coming from the same place. The underlying data that's being provided to the ISO, even if it's split out amongst lots of model resources, it's all kind of the same pot of data that's being provided over. So if there's one error or there's one problem, and it might even be, like I said before, upstream of the demand response provider from maybe the utility that's giving it to them, or who knows, other things that aren't really directly in their control, for example, it could trigger multiple $500 a day penalties for really the same issue underlying. So that's what this is getting at, to sort of add in potentially a small additional clarification that these baseline penalties are treated as though they are, treated as they're on a per FC basis rather than a per resource basis. I was going to say they're treated the same as meter data penalties, but that isn't actually what we want to do because, again, today it's $1,000 a day, today for meter data, $500 per day this, so we're not looking to increase the penalty. And of course, we're also discussing a change in the meter data penalties anyway. So it's not really to make it meter data penalties, but it's to make it comparable in that sense to the meter data penalties, which is that it's applied on a per scheduling coordinator basis versus a per resource basis. So the end result is going to be to lower the penalty exposure for demand response providers if there's an issue with them providing the required baseline data. So with that, I see Perry Cervedio has a hand raised. If you could take that comment, please. Good question.
Hey, this is Perry Cervedio, GDS Associates. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, hi, Perry.
Hey, David, thanks for the description here. I think it's a very simple question I have here. Is the idea to also provide information to the SC about which particular resources the penalties kind of would have been allocated to? So you can, or would you provide some kind of report to the SC so that they would know which particular resource the issue was with, even though you're assessing the penalty to the SC whole?
I assume that would be possible. I couldn't make that commitment. I mean, that it seems reasonable to have that information provided. I won't want to commit because I don't know that it is actually doable, but it seems like it. I would hope it's.
Yeah, I mean, if you're applying them on a per resource basis today, at least the information sharing of which resources were the causes. As you know, some scheduling coordinators are scheduling lots of resources from lots of different companies, and they may have provisions in which they would want to pass through these penalties.
Sure. Yeah, that makes sense. I wouldn't want to commit here that is something I could provide, but yeah, I get what the request is.
Okay, excellent. Thanks, David.
All right. Well, if there's no more questions on this one, we can move on to the next slide. Okay, I made a reference to this before, so here we are. The penalty distribution, there are, like I said before, there's a pro rata allocation based on grid management charge paid by the eligible entities. So there's a couple quirks here that we've run into that we wanted to clarify. Hopefully it's a pretty simple clarification, but so like I referenced before, participants not assessed the penalty in a year are eligible for the pro rata distribution. The potential change would be to clarify that certain entities would be exempt from that. So today, the big exemption, of course, is if you had a penalty assessed, then you're not eligible. But there's two quirks to this that we want to kind of acknowledge and maybe slightly tweak the rules. First one is we have federal power marketing agencies that are exempt from the penalties overall because of a claim of sovereign immunity that, it's the federal government, we can't penalize them. And so that's something we've, kind of thought about some, and we've sort of taken that up, that we would not penalize the federal power marketing entities that are participating in our market. There's a separate process in the tariff that talks about what we do in those cases where we, provide a report to the Secretary of Energy, and there's other kind of administrative things that could apply sort of within the governmental structure. So those entities are not going to ever really be charged penalties. And as well, we have issues where an entity has been assessed the penalty and they go to FERC and appeal the penalty. And if they're successful, then the penalty would be set aside. So in both of those cases, we think it probably makes sense to have them deemed ineligible market participants, meaning that they would not get a pro rata allocation. And so I think, for the case of power marketing entities, I think if they are never exposed to penalties, I think it would stand, there's a rationale there saying if you're never in danger of getting charged the penalty, then the idea of getting a slice of the penalty pie, that is not an incentive for compliance because you were never exposed to penalties in the first place. And then with the entities that have successfully been granted an appeal by FERC, the way the tariff is written, it talks about if you are not assessed a penalty, then you're eligible. And I think, if you got an appeal, it would mean that you had the violation, but FERC has said, we think in these circumstances, the dollar penalty is inappropriate. You're off the hook. You don't have to pay it. That's fine, but there's still the underlying, violation of whatever that happened. And so it wouldn't be appropriate for that entity to still be treated as though nothing happened and treated as though, it never had a violation. So that's something that's on the table. There are maybe some details to work out for the entities that have been granted a waiver. I mean, in theory, you could distinguish between entities whose appeal was granted on the basis of the penalty being excessive versus FERC determining that no violation ever happened in the first place. If the nature of the appeal was granted on the basis that FERC said, ISO, you got it wrong, there was no actual violation, maybe that entity should remain eligible. So there's some details there to really dig into, but the general idea is, if you had a violation, but for some reason you weren't penalized, you shouldn't be eligible for pro rata distribution. The fact that you avoided paying the penalty is sort of good for you, but you shouldn't get the additional bonus of getting a proportion of other entities' penalties that were assessed. So if we have any questions on that, I'm happy to take them.
There are no questions in the queue.
All right, very good. Well, we can move on to the next slide then. So referenced before, there's a generally applicable $500 a day penalty for late submission of tariff-required information. So that is the current rule, and it talks about if the tariff has a deadline specified, then that's the deadline, or it's the deadline the ISO has authority to implement. And in most of these, or all of these cases, I think, what we've done is we've created a BPM process for something that we would be specifically looking to back up the submission requirement with the penalty, because if there's lots of tariff requirements to submit all sorts of information. In a lot of cases, there isn't a specifically identified deadline in the tariff. And so what we've done in several of these cases is then have a BPM process to specify, here is the deadline for it, and then that will then create a deadline upon which the $500 a day penalty can be assessed. And that's how we do it today. One thing to potentially change is, instead of making this a generally applicable provision, go in and really identify what are the specific information submission requirements that are covered by this, that are important enough to say, we really need to back this up with a $500 a day penalty. And so this one is something to discuss. I think there's even me explaining that, I could see arguments both ways for why, why we could go either direction. I mean, I think there is value in specifically identifying the provisions. It's a pretty big project on our end, but I could see how there would be value from market participants for us to do that. On the other hand, there's another question about why is it a tariff requirement if we're not backing it with the $500 a day penalty? Is it, why do we have that requirement in the first place? So there's sort of cuts both ways, but I think that's something that's at least worth having a bigger discussion about. I think certainly as we move to hopefully the EDAM, a lot more expanded information submission requirements, even beyond the existing WEIM structure. I think this topic may become even more salient than it is now in terms of all these different information submission obligations kind of cutting across various entities. What does that mean? How would potential penalties apply? So that's really an important reason, I think, why we should have that discussion and just sort of see where this goes. Like I said, I'm not 100% sure what even I think is the right approach here, but I think it's too important to just sort of let linger. So that's why this is here, and we'll talk about that. We have a scope for track 2, and we'll see where that discussion goes. And so if we have any questions queued up, we can take those now.
No questions in the queue.
Very good. And we can go to the next slide, please. All right. So this next one is, the meter, like I said, the meter data penalty was the big one. This is another sort of detailed thing that can matter if you're in the situation of having a penalty. Otherwise, you've never been in this scenario, you probably don't have much appreciation of what this is really talking about. But this topic is about the penalty tolling eligibility. So we have something in section 37.8.10 that says, if as a market participant you're going to appeal to FERC on a penalty, you have to submit a timely settlement dispute to the ISO as well. If you do that, then the ISO will toll application of the penalties, meaning we will, we'll stop the penalty process. And if you want to appeal to FERC, that's fine. And if FERC takes, that process for whatever reason takes a year to play out, that's fine. We're not going to hold your money for that year. So it seems, fair rule to have. The question here is just sort of a implementation question, how that works. So how it's, until recently, the way it's always worked is that we'll charge the penalty, and then if an entity appeals to FERC and submits the timely settlement dispute, then we will return the funds as soon as we can on the next available, recalculation settlement statement. And so we'll collect the money, and if you appeal, then we'll give it back, and then the FERC process plays out. So the ISO will have invoiced the money and have it for a short period and then give it back, and then if FERC grants the appeal, then everything's even and there's no penalty to collect. If FERC denies the appeal, then the ISO would go back and re-invoice that amount. And like I said, if it's a year for the process to play out, that's fine. Then we'll re-invoice it a year later or what have you. The issue that we've recently kind of been forced to think about is if an entity says, hey, tariff says you told the penalty, we get that we could pay it and then get it refunded a week later, but the tariff says it's told. We shouldn't ever have to sort of hand the money over and wait for it to be refunded, even if it is a week or 2 weeks or whatever. And we thought about that, and we kind of said, well, yeah, it's a good point. There's just a processing issue here, which is that to submit a dispute, the charge has to show up on a settlement statement. If it never shows up on a settlement statement, then there's nothing to dispute. So has to be on a settlement statement. And then, but once it's on a settlement statement, then it's automatically then going to pass to the relevant invoice, which means there's no real way in the process to stop the penalty from being invoiced once it shows up on a settlement statement. So then it gets into the question of, well, can you just not pay the invoice or net the invoice of the penalty? And what we've sort of landed on is, yes, that's probably the best way of doing it. So, that's the way of an entity to really take full advantage of the tolling provision. But that's a manual process on our end, and anytime we're coming into the invoicing process with a short payment, even if it's this scenario where we kind of know it's okay, it's not an entity in default. If they're netting the invoice by the amount of the penalty, we can plan for that, and we know it's a special scenario where it's okay, it's not a settlement default or payment default or anything like that. It's not going to trigger margin calls, whatever. It's still a manual process we have to do on our end, and I think manual processes are, by their nature, they can sometimes, fail. And so, like I said, we just have it set up so we know, okay, don't treat this as a default, but, we have all sorts of automated processes in place to handle, because a payment default is a pretty serious thing, and, we have to have processes that kick in. So there's still the risk that those would be inadvertently triggered in this scenario. Of course, we want to avoid that, but it's a risk. Anytime we have to implement a manual process, it's a risk, and we think there's better ways of handling that. Not 100% sure what they would be, but that's the discussion topic, is how to sort of make the penalty tolling provision work better, consistent with the existing settlement sort of infrastructure and the invoicing process, how to make that work better that doesn't involve the ISO having to do this manual process, but then it also, and also that it's not sort of a special request from the market participant. If the principle is, if you're going to appeal, we're not going to apply the penalty, period, until FERC decides, that should be sort of a more simple process even for the market participant as well. So we don't have any specific tariff change in mind here. It's just something, there needs to be some way to make this work better, and that's really the thing to discuss in track 2. So again, if there's any clarifying questions, please ask them now. Otherwise, we can move to the next slide. And I have not been keeping track. I think it was 9 topics. I'll confess, I've just been talking. I haven't been counting on my fingers what number we're on. Is this like maybe 7 or 8 at this point? Just want to make sure I'm doing okay on time.
David, you're doing good on time, and we don't have any questions.
Fair enough. Okay, well, then this next one is it's back to the meter data penalties. So we talked about that before. We talked about, and this is a sort of an interesting, sort of response. There was a question about, well, what about meter data penalties only if there's a market harm in the sense of an over-reporting of gen, under-reporting of load? That is already a concept embedded in the market adjustment provisions. And so let me explain what those are. So when we have a meter data penalty, you can have a late submission of meter data or a late revision to meter data, whichever. Typically, we have a deadline, but we still have opportunities to run it through a later recalculation settlement statement. So the correct data will still run through the process. Everyone's settlement amounts will be adjusted based on the new data. And so entities will be made whole. And then, like I was saying before, there's still an element of market harm in that settlement statements are being shifted after what we've identified as the last settlement statement produced in the regular course of business. So even if the dollars are then corrected to be correct, there's still sort of a harm of sort of doing it too late. So, but there are cases when we do not run the corrected data through the settlement process, and that gets determined by where we are in the settlement timeline, and that's a separate topic. But there are cases when that happens, and so what Section 3711 and parts of 37523 talk about is when the data is not going to be run through settlement process, we have a market adjustment charge that is meant to be a proxy of what would have happened had the data been run through the settlement process. And so it's a relatively simple calculation. It's the charge is megawatts involved times an average price. I think this is what I was talking about before. We don't kind of go, 5-minute interval by 5-minute interval tracking LMPs for each time period and so on. It's a rough calculation, but it's, probably, well, it's, close enough to be a proxy. Like I said, it's a proxy. It's not meant to be 100% exact, but close enough. So it's megawatts times price. So that's the adjustment charge, but it's only charged, in the case where there was an over-reporting of generation or under-reporting of load, which is meaning that the entity benefited from its initial misreporting. If the initial reporting was to the detriment of the entity, then there's no market adjustment. There, the market adjustment would be a payment back to them. And so we're saying you don't get a payment back if you kind of are so late that we couldn't run it through the settlement process. So the charge of the market adjustment, we don't see a need to revisit that. But what we see a quirk here is what happens to that charge. How do we allocate it out? And the existing tariff says it's allocated out pro rata by UFE in the impacted utility area. So UFE is unaccounted for energy, and I realize now looking at that using the acronym UFE here out of context might have been confusing and not very descriptive. So unaccounted for energy is sort of a catch-up charge that the ISO basically assesses. It's for unaccounted for energy. It's basically there's sort of megawatts that were accounted for in the meters but weren't accounted for in the market schedules. There's sort of a true up there for the missing megawatts that aren't accounted for by the schedules and so on. So that gets charged out by utility area. So the logic there is if there was a misreported meter data, that was going to show up in a charge for UFE in that area. And so therefore, the collected market adjustment, it makes sense to then allocate out the collection pro rata by UFE, because then that's sort of, roughly refunding the parties that had to pay for the initial misreporting. So it's sort of the balance there. So that still makes sense, except for the case what we've now confronted with WEIM entities where, I don't know all of them, but probably most of them, they're the sole entity exposed to paying UFE charges in their utility area. So the question there is, if you have a market adjustment, you can charge it to the WEIM entity, you collect the money, but then how does that make sense to take that money and immediately refund it to them pro rata by UFE paid because they paid 100% of the UFE? So how do you square that? And the existing tariff sections do talk about this. What we want to do is clarify that language. So the existing language talks about market adjustments as if the market adjustment is distributed out and it's made the parties whole who are impacted by the initial misreporting, any funds remaining go to the rules of conduct escrow account to be treated as though they were a penalty. So, that language suggests to us it is appropriate to then, in that situation I talked about, if it's the WEIM entity, to then not immediately refund them back the charge, but that should get shifted over to the escrow account because, you know, the impacted entity has been made whole. It was made whole initially because it you know, in theory, misreported the data. They were charged UFE at that time, so the market adjustment isn't necessary to make them whole. They were an impacted party, they would be whole, therefore the funds flow over to the escrow account. That is a little complicated of an explanation, so we look to just clarify the tariff there to be clear that funds go to the escrow account if the WEIM entity has was the only one that would pay the UFE in the area, or another complexity is that in the EIM structure, an entity can opt out of UFE entirely. So then that's even more complicated if we didn't do this, because then it's sort of like there's no even basis for allocating the charge in the first place. So we just look to clarify this point. We do think it's covered today. It's a little hazy, and so it's, you know, better to just be totally clear and not leave it sort of a little bit up in the air as to how that goes. So we'd look to clarify that. And someone helpfully pointed out, Emily Hughes, thank you, you're on topic 8. So one more after this. And if there are no questions, then we can move on to topic 9. You know, we'll have lots of time reserved in the schedule here today to go back to all of these topics. So don't worry if you had a question and forgot what it was and you can't remember at the moment or anything like that. We'll have lots of time remaining before noon to go over all that. Okay, so final topic, and this is interesting because it loops back to one of the comments on meter data penalties. Someone had asked, well, hey, should there be like a free pass, you know, like you can have one per year and you only start charging penalties on the second one. And, you know, that's a thought. And then now we're at late forced outage reporting. That is an existing approach for one of these. And what, you know, the issue here is that is itself problematic. And so this, I'll talk about the late forced outage reporting here specifically, but, you know, I think it's also important to keep this example in mind if we go and have further conversation about meter data penalties or any of the other ones where you say, hey, there should be one free pass or something like that. You know, that sounds good, but it sort of, there's reasons why you would not want to do that. And this is an example of why sometimes it's better not to do that. So what we have, section 37.4.1.2, the current rule says resources must report forced outages within 60 minutes of discovery. So this is, honestly, I'm saying that now. I can't remember if this is only for generation outages or it also applies to transmission outages. Can't remember at the moment, but at the very least it's generation outages, I believe. Pretty sure, you know, honestly, I can't remember right now. But in any case, so you have a forced outage, you have to report it within 60 minutes of discovering the forced outage. So here's the topic to discuss. The existing tariff says the first violation in a calendar month is by definition not a violation. The second violation within the calendar month is deemed a violation, but it triggers a warning letter. And so it's the third violation in a calendar month leads to a financial penalty. I believe it was $500, and then successive violations then have escalating penalties. So, you know, my understanding is that in practice over time, this penalty has almost never been invoked in terms of getting to the third violation in a calendar month that triggers an actual dollar penalty. So it's really problematic that we have, you know, there's a lot of tracking involved. So the first violation you have to track, the second one you have to track the rolling number of violations, et cetera. So there's some complexity on the ISO side and some definite administrative burden to tracking this structure, but we're doing that when there's almost never been any penalties actually assessed. So the concern here is that, you know, getting 2 free passes within a calendar month is not a very stringent standard. And so either we're kind of thinking we should go in one of two ways. Either we eliminate the penalties altogether because, you know, this never really comes up, allowing such a I think I'd say lenient standard, you know, it's not, to my mind, it's probably not too much of an incentive to entities to report on time. So there's good reasons for them to be doing it anyway, good utility practice, being responsible, you know, to entity, all that sort of stuff. But if we're looking solely at the penalties, doesn't seem like this is probably driving too many incentives towards compliance that aren't there already. So either eliminate the penalties altogether and remove the administrative burden on the ISO for tracking this thing, or look at creating stricter penalties by removing the free pass and or warning letter stages. So kind of go one of two directions, either make this penalty a more realistic threat or kind of don't really bother with it at all. So that's where we're going. I would certainly think the direction should be towards removing at least one of those free passes, but also in a way that maybe makes it more administratively feasible for us on the ISO side to not track things in such a complicated way. But that's a topic to discuss, and we'll see where that goes. So, any questions on that? Otherwise, I believe that's the last slide for me, and then we can get into the more kind of substantive discussion later as we go. So, are there any questions teed up right now?
No questions in the queue.
All right. Well, I think that is the end of my part of this presentation, and I think with that, I can pass the mic back to Dinesh.
David, thank you very much for that thoughtful presentation on the 9 topics. I'm sure a lot of the stakeholders here learned plenty. I actually had a question for you, David. We are approaching time for break, but I also think that we should add an extra 15 to 20 minutes here to discuss the 9 topics in further detail and sort of receive questions and feedback. Would you like to take the break first, or would you like to take the break after? Your call. Oh, I think you're on mute.
I did mute myself. Yeah, I'm happy to keep going and take the break later. If you're asking me, I'll say let's keep going.
Then let's keep going. So we would love to have your feedback and input on the 9 topics that we have discussed. Thank you very much for keeping the questions brief and to clarifying questions so far. But here we shall open up the floor. So any questions about any of the 9 topics that we've discussed so far?
So as we wait, you have the option to raise your hand using the raise hand icon below in the middle of the screen, or feel free to send us a chat. Please include your affiliation when asking a comment. And we do have Ian White from Shell Energy. Let's go ahead and unmute Ian. Candace, can you go ahead? Okay, there you go.
Just making sure you can hear me here.
Yes, we can hear you.
Great, thanks. Thanks, Brenda. Thanks for this stakeholder process. I think that it's good to update these items. I should mention Ian White with Shell Energy here. I have a question on slide 14 with respect to meter data penalties. I just was wondering where the ISO came up with the lower of 30% of the value of the air, or the $1,000. Where did that 30% come from? Just curious. I may have missed that earlier in the discussion.
Yeah, we did. Yeah, yeah. So that goes back to what the penalties were initially. So way back when it was first created, it was 30% of the error if self-reported by the scheduling coordinator, 70% if identified by the ISO. And then we, because of how that impacted large loads, basically if you took 30%, if a large load serving entity had a very small processing error, but that small process error led to hundreds, thousands of megawatts being misreported, the penalties, even if it's 30%, got to be a total dollar penalties that were, we agreed were excessive, and so we went to the $1,000 trading day to sort of address that issue, and then, but then, like I said, some of the recent waivers were then the opposite issue, where it was a very small penalty that lasted over a lot of trading days. So then that $1,000 times, hundreds of trading days for a very small megawatt impact sort of didn't look right either. And so that's where we got to the lower of as the, at least starting point of the discussion.
Great. Thanks very much for that.
I don't see no more questions in queue. Go ahead. Wait, there's one question that just came in through chat.
Yeah, I see that. So the question is, how is the value of the error determined? Yeah, so it's the basically the change in megawatts. So that's the megawatt quantity times the price. And that's what I was trying to recall before. I don't remember offhand the old. I think the prior tariff revisions would have specified if it was a strict, interval by interval LMP versus the average price over the time period where there was the issues. Like I was saying, the market adjustment provision, it takes a more rough calculation. It doesn't try to go interval by interval and LMP by LMP. I just don't recall offhand what the old tariff version said, but I think the starting point would be we would just pull whatever the prior provision was. And like I said before, this provision predated the MRTU market, but then I realized I said that, but then it also was in existence during first few years of the nodal market. So we must have made a change at that point. So I think the prior language that was in effect before we went to the $1,000, but after we implemented the nodal market in April 2009, there would be language that was relevant in the current market structure. So we just have to go back and pull that and use that as a starting point, I think. But it should be specified there. I just, maybe in the break I can actually go pull that archived tariff language and I can share that.
Michael Kramick?
Yeah, hi, this is Mike Kramer from Boston Energy. I have a question on the meter data penalties. And if this is already asked, I apologize. I had to step away for a little bit. But regarding more of like late or missing data, some ISOs have some checks where they'll look at their state estimator data and compare it to the meter data. And if they see either missing data or data that is different by some percentage, they flag that and notify the market participant. Has CAISO given any thought to something like that to help try to avoid these situations so we don't have missing data, which causes all kinds of settlement data issues down the road?
Yeah, I think, well, okay, so the first answer is I'm not aware of what checks like that we do today, so it's possible that we do some level of that for the meter data. I'm looking to see. I don't think we have anyone from our metering group on the call right now, but I think as you're saying that, I think part of the issue there would be that, even if there is, we have a check of that nature and identifies that there's some discrepancy, and even if we can isolate it to the party involved, I think the question would be, if you have a deadline by which to submit the revisions, then really I think all that would mean is we could do like a courtesy notice to that scheduling coordinator, say, hey, we did some estimate. It looks like maybe you submitted incorrect meter data for this trade date. Reminder, the deadline to submit, revisions is 2 days from now. Please consider submitting revisions as appropriate. We can do that, but if they don't, submit by that deadline and then they come back 2 weeks later and say, oh, yeah, you're right, we did have it wrong. It's sort of, maybe it would sort of help the process along, but since we have a defined deadline to make the corrections, they either make the correction by the deadline or they're not.
Yeah, I think, David, I think what I was wondering, because apparently PGM does this, where they will send a courtesy notice saying, hey, we see an issue with your meter data, please fix. I think I didn't know if that was something the ISO could do, because my guess is if you did something like that, that would probably help eliminate definitely missing meter data, and depending, I don't know the thresholds PGM uses to flag data. I'm guessing it's not, well, you're 1/10 of a megawatt off or a megawatt off, but there must be some like large problem. So I'm just wondering if that was something you guys thought about to help to help. I'm also assuming this really only applies to SD metered entities, because since ISO pulls most of the meters directly, and those meter cabinets are locked. So I was just wondering if there's ways to flag this stuff for the SD metered entities, so we don't have, they can be more proactive, I guess, or maybe they're not being proactive on their own, and they need your help. That's all I was saying.
Right. Okay, so I think maybe what I was trying to get at before, now that you asked again, I think the answer to that would be maybe, but I think I was referring to it as like a courtesy notice, and I think that's really the point, is like, let's say we know the data is missing, and then we say, hey, the deadline is tomorrow, please submit. All we could do is that, really say, it looks like it's missing, or we know it's missing, you never submitted it, please submit. But if they don't, it's just sort of it would be a reminder, but I don't think it would change the penalty structure. It would just be a new business process we could implement, maybe. We could look at that, but I think it wouldn't be, in other words, I don't think it would be part of the penalty process. It would just be some new process we do to be helpful, or to sort of help things move along more smoothly. But in the end, if it's a deadline and they miss the deadline, they miss it, regardless of whether we gave them a heads up or a reminder or whatever. And then there's still the question about, just technology wise, okay, what can we do to build that out? Is it, how cumbersome is it for the ISO to do that? But yeah, I mean, it's a suggestion we could look at and see if see what it would take. And just as a side note here, I think in one of the initial slides, one of the things made a reference to, actually, I guess I can go back. There was a reference to upstream changes, and Dinesh, do you remember that? There was, something on maybe the second slide or something. That's a good, while we're on this topic, that's a good example of what we meant by sort of an upstream change, is that some courtesy notice or whatever, that's upstream of the penalty process. So that's not a change to what the penalty provisions say, but that is something to talk about. Maybe that is an upstream change that would help the penalty process move better, or at least, maybe at that point it's easier for the ISO to say, take a more firm line on the enforcement, say, well, hey, we gave you a heads up 3 days before the deadline and you still didn't do it. We have less concern in this instance that the penalty is disproportionate or unfair, because not only did you miss the deadline, but we also gave you a reminder, you still missed. Things like that do inform the overall penalty process. So that is a good example of what we're thinking of in terms of an upstream change that could be worth exploring, even if we don't actually see the impact in Section 37 of the tariff.
That's a great point, David, and that's something else we're also considering throughout this initiative about whether what aspects we can do as an ISO to make sure that we avoid penalties, because the point of the penalties is so that everybody is in compliance. But if there are other ways we can make sure everybody is in compliance without having to resort to penalties, that would be ideal. So other upstream related kind of concerns, questions, that is also in scope in this discussion. So if you've got any sort of feedback related to these 9 topics that you'd like to see more upstream guidance, please feel free to bring it up too. Thank you.
Jennifer Gerard. Jennifer Gerard, please make sure your phone is set to mute.
Hi, this is Jennifer Gerard at Idaho Power. Can you guys hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great, thanks. Appreciate this. And since we're kind of on this slide, I thought I'd just ask a couple follow-up questions. And then I did have kind of an idea on upstream as well. So as far as the missing, or sorry, the inaccurate meter data, is this on slide 14 right here, is this also going to look at the missing meter data of 3,000 a day, or is that kind of out of scope? So that'd be the first question I have. Are you looking at that $3,000 a day if it's missing, or is it just the inaccurate meter data? So that's my first question.
Okay, so to make sure everyone's following along, we hadn't scoped this in any of the slides yet, but the reference to the $3,000 is in case. So there's the regular deadline to submit data, which is, I think, was it T48B. So if you miss that deadline, it's late, and then the next settlement statement produced in the regular course, or it's actually, the next one is not produced in regular course, but if it is produced, it would be produced, I forgot the timeline now. So there's the next one, and then there's an opportunity to submit missing or revised data for that one. If you fail to submit anything for the last one that's produced in the regular course, and you fail to submit anything for the next settlement statement, then there's a $3,000 a day penalty, because then it's sort of an escalating penalty. It's, you failed to meet the deadline, and then you also failed to meet like the remediation deadline. So the idea is, well, that's even worse, and that's really a problem. So there's an escalating penalty from that. So I'll confess, we hadn't thought it through. I mean, I just sort of thought about it initially, said, no, we need to keep that penalty in place. But I don't know. I didn't think about it in a whole lot of detail. I don't know if others have about, I think there should be, and I think it's appropriate to have a higher penalty if an entity just totally blows by all of those deadlines. Whether it should remain, whether, for example, it would be 30% of the error, $1,000 trading day, on the assumption that eventually the correct data gets in by the deadline for the second deadline, but it's that plus $3,000. I don't know that I had any firm thoughts on that. I don't know if others did, but that's something we have to look at. And, there's a comment here that's reminding me, I said I made a reference to T48B. Thank you, Glenn, for reminding me that the calendar had changed at one point about 2 years ago, and I was fumbling with the deadline. So please don't listen to me on the deadlines on the payment calendar. Please go to KISO.com, pull up the current payment calendar. If you're trying to remember what any of the settlement deadlines are, don't listen to me. Go to the website, pull up the current calendar that's posted if you were relying on whatever I just said to guide your participation in the market. But thank you, Glenn, for reminding. I said the date wrong.
So
okay.
Jennifer.
Jennifer.
Yes.
So Jennifer, so in order to answer your questions, we do the penalty, we calculate the penalty for both late meter, and if you submit within, you submitted within T+52B, but the meter data was an error. For both, we calculate the penalty. And it is T+52B, like Glenn mentioned. Thanks, Glenn.
Correct.
Does that help,
Okay.
Jennifer?
Yeah, I just was curious because I know there's a reference to 3,000. So I was just curious if that one was also being part of in scope of this or not. So I guess we'll kind of more to come as you think about that. I guess my next question is kind of related, going back to this 30% of the error. And I don't know, maybe this is something that as you guys are going to put out the paper, it might be good to put some examples that would be helpful for us to kind of look at what the impact would be. Because I do have kind of a question more from, as a scheduling coordinator, you submit a meter value, that same meter goes into your your ELAP or your load. So if they offset each other, I guess that's kind of my question is when you're calculating the value of the error, are you looking at just the generator? Because obviously there's an offsetting impact to your load for a scheduling coordinator that has both the generation and the load. Are you looking at the net value of that error, or are you looking at kind of more of an absolute value? So, and if you don't know, that's fine if you need to think about it, or I guess I would just ask as you guys are going through this, maybe to provide some examples like that. So as we go through, we can kind of evaluate that.
Yeah, I realize now. I think what I was saying before was it would be the, I think I said it would be the net value because it's the total megawatt value reported by a scheduling coordinator. So if the load changed, 20 megawatts in one direction, gen change in 10 megawatts the other direction, the net is, you take the net, and that's what the overall change is. But I think, when these provisions applied, they were, not applying in the WEIM context because it didn't exist then. So, yeah, that's a good point that maybe we do have to think that through and maybe have more specificity than there was maybe in the old language because, we have different scenarios that wouldn't have applied then anyway. So, yeah,
right.
I see the point.
Okay. And then the last thing, I apologize. Oh, go ahead.
Thanks.
Sorry, Jen. So I just wanted to jump in and say these have both been really great questions. And these are exactly the types of things that we were hoping to sort of hear from you and other stakeholders while we are kind of thinking and considering what is even in scope for this initiative. Whether this falls into track 1, track 2, specifically talking about the $3,000 a day penalty is up in the air, but these are the types of topics that we really appreciate you bringing up. So thanks. Please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. And then the last one, just thinking about upstream, maybe thinking about in scope, I know for us, some of the things the challenges that we've experienced being a WEIM entity is really just kind of from the very start of meter setup and just really making sure that, as we think about upstream, as we think about, making sure that we're setting up meter data to be accurately calculated, that we really have clear guidelines around expectations around metering, specifically like station use and whether losses need to be applied. So things like that where it can be really clear. I know for us, that's kind of been a little bit more of a challenge is really understanding and having a clear understanding of what the BPMs are requiring around that. And I know it's, we've bugged KISO a lot and asked a lot of questions. And I think it would probably even save time on behalf of KISO just to really maybe have some more specific guidelines, maybe even more specifically for WEIM entities and around meter requirements. As we kind of think about what could help kind of improve the accuracy. So I know that's kind of been a little bit of a challenge for us. So I'm not sure if that's something that could be in scope or just maybe down the road. That would be great. So that was my thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. Appreciate that.
Okay, and just real quick, I see there was a comment from a participant here in the chat to us saying they agree with the statement regarding metering guidelines. Again, like Dinesh said, that's another example of the sort of upstream things we were talking about where it would help sort of maybe avoid penalty situations from rising.
Thomas Payne?
Yeah, good morning, everyone. Thomas Payne from SCE. Yeah, first of all, yeah, if you mentioned earlier that if CalISO can look into any sort of reminder for missing data, that would help us a lot. Because right now we have a lot of process to make sure that we're not missing any meter data. But if there's a reminder from CalISO, that'll be good. Second question is for the DR demand response program. If there's any missing performance data submission to CalISO, is there any penalties right now?
The question is for the demand response. Do we currently assess the penalties for late baseline data?
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, the baseline data, not the performance.
Right. We don't have a specified deadline yet for that. So there isn't a good basis for applying them. But so my understanding is they're not applicable yet. But yeah, so with the word deadline, it would be applying on a per resource basis.
Okay, so it's only applied to the performance data, and then you guys, for this round, just to clarify that rather than per resources, it would be per SC ID, the penalty.
Yeah.
Okay, all right, that's all I have. Thank you.
And I'd like to go back to one topic real quick. There was the questions before about the prior percentage penalties, and I pulled up the last version of CARE if I could find it had the old penalties. First of all, let me say I was saying 70%. It was actually 75%. So it was 30% if it's self-reported. It's 75% if it was ISO discovered. That was under the old provision. Just small correction there. It was 75%, not 70%. But going to the question about how we were calculating the penalty, it was the megawatt hours misreported. So that's the quantity of change, and that was regardless of whether it was an over-reported or under-reported, regardless of the market harm in the sense of shorting the market of payment initially. So it was megawatt hours times an applicable price. The applicable price defined in the tariff was the greater of the relevant hourly LMP or $10 per megawatt hour. And then it says the LMPUs will be the values posted on Oasis for each trading hour of the applicable trading day period. So that was the old provisions. I think maybe maybe we'd have to tweak that a little bit to fit the current sort of market terminology and so on. But it was basically the greater of the hourly LMP or $10. So to answer the question about how it was working under the old provisions.
Glenn Perez from Trimark. Hi, please make sure your phone isn't set to mute. We're not getting audio. I apologize, but you want to check your device to make sure that it's not muted.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Okay, thank you. Hey, David, just to follow up on that, the previous calculation, there was also a provision there if you didn't rerun the market in that in those calculations, so that if you didn't rerun the market, the penalty for underreported generation and overreported load wouldn't have been calculated because you were harming yourself versus the market. But
Right.
yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, I think that's right. So we might not just take it fully off the shelf, but yeah, there was the market adjustment. So this is for cases where the CAISO does not perform a recalculation settlement statement, and the scheduling coordinator does not owe the market, then no market adjustment will be performed. Is that what you were referring to?
Yeah. So in other words, if you over-reported load, and at the time we didn't have the ISO didn't have the streamlined settlement system now, so it was a decision of whether or not to do a market rerun or a market adjustment. So just wanted to add that there were provisions at the time for not doing market adjustment.
Yeah, that's right.
But one of the things I was hoping that the ISO might be able to provide the market on when we go through these issues is the transparency of the, maybe over the last couple of years of the penalties that have been initiated. And as someone had mentioned, they were concerned about, the number of entities that I think the initial question was, what percentage of people actually get the cost adjustment, gets the money back on the GMC. I don't know if that's an easy thing to do, but you at least can see how many penalties and separate number of scheduling coordinators that might have been issued, the specific type of penalties over the last couple of years. I'm finding it hard to go through and find on the website the FERC filings for the penalty distribution. So, summarizing that information over the last couple of years might be useful and help inform us on how many times these penalties are really being implemented. And, if we're actually through the rules of conduct preventing and incenting appropriate behavior, or if we actually have appropriate behavior without any more incentives. So that would be helpful, I think, if we had some summary information.
Yeah, that's fine. I was referring, earlier in the call to, you can pull it from our annual filings. I was saying that if someone needed to know like right now, but I think, for the next round of a policy paper or something, yeah, sure. I mean, that's information that is going to be a lot easier for us to compile and summarize, and expecting people to go wade through our annual filings over the last decade or whatever. So yeah, I mean, that's not very hard for us to pull together. I just meant if someone is super interested and wants to know right now, that's one way they can do it on their own. But we can definitely pull that together in the next sort of iteration of all this.
Yeah, that's great, because good luck on anybody trying to go through the filings to find that. it's not word searchable. On the second note, do we have any reporting from the market monitoring group if in fact the rules of conduct is performing as intended?
Well, that's a good question. We could, you know, I think that, you know, no, I won't want to speak for them. I think that's a fair question. We can maybe ask for their feedback and as this process continues.
Yeah, I think we've gone, and ISO and the market has gone a long way since the initiation of the rules of conduct. And I'm not too sure if these behaviors are to the point where we really need penalties. So I think it would be really good to not only look at maybe slight adjustments to the penalties, but look at whether or not they're actually needed. And, you know, hopefully we get a chance to make some more comments like that on the initial documentation. So thank you.
Thank you. Very much appreciated. With that, I'm not seeing any more questions or comments in the queue. Are there any on the phone line?
No questions on the phone.
Okay. With that, I think we'll head into about let's say an 8-minute break, come back at 11:10. While you were also going on break, the next 2 topics are going to be on additional scope items and also whether or not you as a stakeholder community think that our track categorization is the best that we can make it. So while you're on break, feel free to think about those topics. We are going to turn it over, and we're very excited to hear more from you all about those agenda items. So thank you. See you at 11:10. So just, you know, as brought up earlier by a participant, the impact of the rules of conduct may be very different on your side than how we intended them to be. In that sense, I personally feel that you may know better than we, the ISO, knows about like what issues you are facing or what concerns you're facing in regards to the rules of conduct. Thank you very much, Jen. Thank you very much, Jen, for bringing up the missing data penalty. That is a perfect example of a topic that I think we will need to explore more and think about. And that's also the type of topic that I'd love to hear more about from you, the stakeholders, about are there things that we need to explore? Are there any topics that you feel that maybe we should not be exploring out of the 9? That's the type of thing that I'd love to hear about, and I think we as a team would love to hear about in this session. So I'm going to turn it over, and let's have at it.
As a reminder for those on the phone line, you have press #2 to ask a question, and those who are in WebEx, please use the raise hand icon below in the middle of the screen. So I don't see any questions, but Candace, do you have any questions on the audio line?
No, not at this time.
Okay, so to kick it off then, there is one thing that I did think we need to discuss a little further. Jen and Thomas, you brought up potential upstream changes. Now that is not exactly in the initiative, but it's 100% relevant and related. And I guess my initial thinking here is that, reminders for data submission may be like playing whack-a-mole, where it's like, if there are too many notices out, then it's going to be overwhelming amount of notices and information. Whereas if there are too few, then, we may miss something along the line. So I was just curious if you or if anyone else had any specific feedback about what topics would be, or what specific reminders would be helpful from the ISO. Feel free to share that verbally. If it's something that you all want to think about, feel free to bring up in the written comments as well. Thanks.
Dinesh, we do have someone, two folks on the phone line. Let's go ahead for the first person, UTCast. Please introduce yourself as well.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Hi, Dinesh. There is one particular topic that, this is Stuart Kelly representing LADWP. There was one particular topic that we get impacted by on Go Live, and it was an error on Kaiso's side when it comes to GHG attribution. And it meant significant dollar loss, actually, that was attributed to LA, where LA was paying other participants. And ultimately, there was no recourse for that. And it also meant that the meter data that was filed with the California commissions was erroneous. And that's something that I think probably falls in the scope of this. And we can send you more information if you would like on the particular matter offline. But that's something I just want to raise, that, there was an error with Kaiso. The actual data that was submitted to CARB, and everyone was aware of the problem, but there was no way of correcting the problem, even although we're within the current reporting year.
Thank you very much. And I think I heard your name was Stuart. Thank you very much, Stuart, for bringing that up. I would love to see that that information. And we can definitely talk more. I think it's definitely something we need to look into, is if there's an error on the Kaiso end, how, if and when there should be some sort of recourse there. So definitely something in scope, and thank you very much for bringing that up.
Hi, Dinesh. I don't see any other questions, but if someone likes to ask a question, use the raise hand icon below in the window. If not, we will go ahead and move on to the next slide. So we'll give a moment for our stakeholders.
Yeah, let's give it another couple minutes, maybe till maybe honestly until 11:25. We'll just, for people to think, for people and if some, oh, we've got someone else.
Hello, this is Lin from PG&E. Sorry, before that I have a lot of technical issue. So just wanted a question about the additional rules of conduct topics. I think one of the items, this probably will be more on the upstream. One of the items that we have right now, we're tracking all those sanctions, more on the ISO meter, telemetry, all this non-compliance. It's through the 3-letter process, and it's pretty cumbersome right now in terms of how we manage and work with all the plan owner and work with the SC and us, right, in managing and maintaining it. I'm not sure. It's not part of your presentation right now. I was wondering whether maybe we can consider that as one of the process improvements and put it in scope 2 in terms of discussion on how to manage those more ISO meter telemetry issue.
Thank you, Lynn, for bringing that up. Could you go into a little bit more detail here? I'm not I don't think I've understood sort of the concern here at this level. Thank you.
I think it's more, Mark from PG&E probably can explain a little bit better. He just came back. But I think right now with all this telemetry, if they're not, if there's a disconnection or anything, we usually get a notification from our plant owner, the facility site. The SC has to get involved, the plant owner has to get involved, right? In terms of how to get them online and make sure that they are stay in compliance. If they miss that, they'll get a $500 sanction. That's the process that goes on. And for us as the SC right now, we're also tracking together with the facility in terms of whether they're online, they're basically if they meet their requirement. And Mark actually raised his hand. I actually will let Mark explain to you better in terms of the process from PG&E. Maybe he can explain better than me. So actually, if you can unmute him, and he probably can explain the process.
I think before we do that, I think I'm going to pass this off. Oh,
yeah.
I think David understands sort of a little bit more deeply what the question is, so I'm going to pass it off to him if he wants to respond first. Thank you.
So, yeah, well, I was hearing this. I thought that the concern is sort of questions where, you know, you might be the scheduling coordinator for, you know, lots of various resources, you know, owned by various different plant owners, plant operators, et cetera. And then, so you, because of the contracting or whatever, you serve as a scheduling coordinator. And so if those various plants have issues with their telemetry goes down, they don't fix it in time, they are then subject to penalties for that. I think your question is there ways to make that process more manageable for an entity such as yourself, where you are the scheduling coordinator, not for, you know, your owned, your, you know, portfolio of 10 plants you own and operate, and you're also the SC, where it's easy, but where you're the SC for this whole portfolio of plants that have different plant operators, different owners, et cetera. You're looking for a way to better kind of manage that process. Was that what your comment was getting at?
Yes, thank you, David. Yes, and Mark can explain a little bit better if he's still online. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, good morning. This is Mark Teams with PG&E. Thanks so much for hosting this call. Yeah, the current process, there's a lot of, there's a weekly email that includes a spreadsheet tracker from EDAS, and then PG&E maintains our own internal spreadsheet tracker, and then everything's managed via emails and spreadsheets. So there might be an opportunity to have a more automated process or something in a portal or a KAISO application, which would have an automated way to keep the status of everything apprised and kind of eliminate the more manual, cumbersome process of tracking everything with emails and spreadsheets. So that was the idea. Didn't know if this is the right forum for that, or we have some more documentation we can share with the KAISO offline too to discuss this, but there might be some low-hanging fruit to optimize this for both the KAISO EDAS side and for scheduling coordinators and stakeholders.
Mark, thank you very much. Low-hanging fruit is great. If we can make that happen, and we can, you know, if we can optimize better, great. So let's definitely take this offline. We can definitely look at that tracking and seeing whether there are optimizations to be made, especially on automated notices. So feel free to send us an email about that, and we'll take this offline and go from there. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you, will do.
Jennifer Gerard.
Hi, Jennifer Gerard at Idaho Power again. I had one more topic that I forgot to mention that I think might be a good in-scope to add to this. The other kind of issue that that as I think about meter data and penalties and is really the timelines, the meter submission timelines. And I don't know if that's something that we could take a look at with this initiative. I think, you know, obviously, like you said today, the last chance you have is that 52 business day to kind of get in all your meter data. And if there's something kind of inadvertently that happens or you identify something later, obviously, if you are beyond that 52 business day, then you are subject to the rules of conduct. One of the things that might be good to look at is how often is CAISO resettling beyond the T70B statement. So how many times are they, you know, resettling 11-month statements, for example? And because it seems like today we constantly will get a T11 month and maybe a 20-month 1 month. So I'm just trying to understand the impact, you know, if the penalties are really, you know, kind of twofold. One, the work it takes to go resettle these trade dates, but then also to, you know, we want to incentivize people to submit accurate meter data. So I, you know, just kind of thinking about, you know, what if that meter submission was kind of pushed out further to allow, if in some of these cases, if there was something that was caught and you caught it too late and you wanted to be able to resubmit it and resubmit it accurately, what is really the impact? You know, what is that market impact to others and to the CAISO to do that? And so that's just something to maybe think about. I don't know, you know, maybe it's outside of the scope of this, but it does feel like if there was an opportunity to resubmit that meter data and resubmit it accurately and not be subject to the rules of conduct penalty, if it doesn't really have a huge impact, I think one thing to think about in today's market, you know, RTIS submissions or interchange submissions don't have that same deadline. So we've seen over the years impacts where people will have to resubmit RTIS submissions that do have actually an impact across the market, and there really isn't those aren't subject to a rules of conduct penalty. I'm not proposing that or anything, but it's a similar situation where those can be resubmitted later. And so just something I think as we think about this, it's just something to maybe keep in mind is really the purpose behind it. Is it a deliberate misrepresentation of meter data? Is it inadvertent and it just needs to be resubmitted and resettled? And really maybe as we kind of look at, you know, how often penalties are being waived, what's kind of the overall impact, is maybe even also looking at what would really be the impact if those meter submission timelines were potentially changed, or, you know, participants maybe could be allowed to resubmit them at a later time. So just a thought. I don't know what others think, but yeah, that was the other thing I was thinking about. So thank you.
Thank you, Jen. Really appreciate those comments. I think in regards to the RTIS data, that is definitely a different process that we can look more into as a team about whether there are any similarities there, whether there's any synergies where we can, you know, leverage what's going on there and, you know, streamline processes here. About the actual sort of magnitude of penalties, and then also for and sort of the idea around deliberate versus inadvertent. From my understanding, as it currently stands at the FERC level, we are supposed to maintain objective rules of conduct, and anything that becomes subjective needs to be taken to FERC for a potential waiver. So in that case, we don't really have that flexibility. On the flip side, though, the hope is if we are changing the current meter data penalty setup so that it is the lower of $1,000 a day or per trading day, or 30% of the market impact. If the market impact from the sort of the issues with the submission is small, then that 30% of that impact should also be small. Does that get to what you're saying a little bit?
Yeah, I definitely agree with that, and I see where you're saying that it needs to be objective, and so I completely understand that. I guess maybe it's more what I'm looking at is just could we consider the meter timelines? Because it does seem like there's constant resettlement where there's an opportunity for, you know, market participants to be able to correct that data if something inadvertently happened. I think it maybe could minimize the amount that is being addressed through even the rules of conduct process. So maybe that's more where I'm getting at is, could there be a consideration of those timelines and the impact if those were to be moved out to give participants longer? I understand there comes a point where you have to just cut it off, and I'm not proposing that we have that be an indefinite timeline, but I just it seems like it might help the overall efficiency of this process of what it's really trying to achieve is really, you know, obviously wanting to incentivize accurate reporting, but you know, maybe giving, if you could push that timeline out so that there is that greater opportunity in the event that something's caught later, you know, or inadvertently you catch something through your annual testing process, or, you know, because we all have that annual SQMD testing process and validation that we go through, and we're trying to confirm that everything is accurate. So just a thought, I don't know if it's something to be included in scope, but it might help prevent future rules of conduct processes from having to occur, I guess, is kind of where I'm getting at. So appreciate the consideration. I understand that maybe not everything can be included, but might be something worth pursuing.
Thank you for sharing that. I think from my current understanding of what would happen is, you know, if we start changing the timelines, we are going to get into a lot of trouble across the board. Like, it will be a it will require a very long and sort of very large transition on the ISO's end, affecting all sorts of different markets, teams, participants. So I'm going to just upfront say that it will be unlikely that this would be possible to do given the timeline and scope of the initiative. But we very much appreciate you mentioning that, and if it's something that you would like to include in your written comments, feel free to go ahead and include it there as well.
Okay, thank you, and understood. I understand that. Yeah, so thank you for considering that.
Jane Matthews. Jane Matthews.
Hi, I actually submitted a chat topic. Would you like me to just read it, or?
Yeah, please go ahead. Sorry if we missed that.
Right. So I'd like to know if for additional rules of conduct, if there's an ISO qualified meter data management agent, such as a utility generator, that reports erroneous data to its scheduling entities, is there consideration for penalties to be assessed to the utility generator for inaccurate data, and the burden of restatement and correction with the ISO be put on the utility generator?
Hi, Jane, this is David. I'll take that one. So I can point you to section 37.9.3.3, which is existing tariff. You know, you might want to take a look at that. There's a provision there that talks about where a party or parties other than the scheduling coordinator is responsible for the conduct giving rise to a penalty. You know, there's cost shifting provisions that can be invoked. I don't believe those have been invoked to date, but yeah, it's existing tariff. You might want to take a look at that, and that might somewhat address the concern you're raising. But I think, you know, because those provisions, to my understanding, have not been utilized much, if at all, to your point, it might be that we would want to maybe clarify them or kind of flesh them out a little bit more if it's the case that those would likely be invoked more going forward. But yeah, starting point, you can look at 37.9.3.3. It's titled Other Responsible Party.
Okay, thank you.
Ken Donald.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. If I could take a step backwards for a second, I couldn't get my comment in quickly enough to follow up directly after Jennifer made her last point about extending the submittal timeline. I'd like to know exactly what it is that would be so onerous to take on in order to facilitate that, because I'm of a mind that right now it's already possible to submit beyond what is the free of penalty deadline metering. All that would be required is just to redefine what is how long it should be before it's subject to a penalty. Am I not thinking about this correctly?
I'm not sure if I exactly sort of understood what you were saying there, Ken. I think
I can help finish.
Oh, please. Thank you very much, Ramon.
Hi, Ken. So what Jennifer's question is, currently we have the T+52B is the last deadline, right? To submit the metadata or incorrect metadata, resubmit the incorrect metadata. So after the T+52B, the ROC will trigger. And she was wondering that since ISO is calculating T+11 months, T+21 months, and 24 months, we are recalculating settlement statement. She is wondering that whether we can extend the T+52B timeline to perhaps to T+11 months. That was her concern.
I think there's a lot of merit to that idea. I think the reason that we're doing the subsequent rerun settlements is for no less malicious occurrences than late metering. I think that's exactly the kind of things that rerun submissions are supposed to help clear up.
Understood, Ken. But you know that T+11 month, T+21 month is an optional settlement statement. So we do not do that every trade day.
Not so far,
probably,
they haven't been, right? Pretty much a regular thing.
No, but guess what? So one of the issue is some of the entities are submitting the tag quantity after the fact, resubmitting the tag quantity. Currently, she also mentioned that currently we do not have the penalty for the tag quantity, ATF tag, right, that you're providing to settlements. We do not have tag. So she was saying that probably we can assess penalty to that too. So some of the entities are resubmitting the tax. That is one of the reasons. And when we identify a market issue which impacts everybody, when we get a dispute or when we, internally, if there is a market issue we are researching, and if that is impacting every entity, we are trying to do that more and more on the T+11B, T+11 month and T+21 month. So we do not want to extend the timeline for the, timeline for the metadata after T+52B. But we will definitely look into it, but that's not part of, within this scope, but we can look into it.
Right.
And like she suggested, we can also assess penalty for late submitting after the fact tax. That also we can look into it.
So the experience thus far after the settlement timeline changed, if I'm not overstepping, I think it's shown that the idea that we can wrap up settlements in 2 passes was overly ambitious. right? I don't know that a single operating day has passed for which we have not done the 11-month, 21-month, or 24-month. Is that accurate?
I'm not sure because it is an optional settlement statement, but if there are any market issues which impacted those trade dates, we are trying to cover it. So I'm not sure. I need to look into the settlements drawing to see that. But most of the trade
in
dates,
comparison to other markets, no one is finishing settlements in 2 passes, and I don't know why we would think that that would be different in California or cleaner in California. I think the door is open if you decided to allow later meter data submissions. I don't think it's as onerous as it was described to be. I think it could be an easy fix. And I'll just leave it at that.
okay.
Thank you very much for that, Ken.
Thank you, Ken. We will look into it.
Jared Satram?
Yes. Thank you. Sorry about that. Just following back to, I believe it was Jennifer with Energy bringing up the discussion about invoking this ability to pass through any late meter data penalties onto, say, IOUs. We investigated that pathway briefly, but then just found the lack of detail as far as how that process works to be such that it wasn't worth it for us at the time. So I would just reiterate an interest in fleshing out the details of that further, so scheduling coordinators could potentially take advantage of it. That's all. Thanks.
Thank you, Jared.
Hi, this is Stuart Kelly. I'd just like to support what Jennifer and Ken have stated. I don't think it's as big a deal as what ISO's making out. And I think it's important to actually take the feedback from stakeholders and not close it out, because in my many years of experience, CAISO doesn't experience the same problems that the entities and other SCs experience. So I think you should look at the timelines. I don't think it's an enormous lift by CAISO, and there may even be an additional run inserted before T11, as Ken says. And that has a lot of merit, but I'd just like to support what Jennifer and Ken are exploring here.
Thank you very much, Stuart. We very much appreciate what you've had to say, what Jen has to say, and what Ken has had to say about this topic. And it is definitely something that we will be looking into and to really sort of to understand and sort of see what impacts there will be a little bit and whether or not it's something we can further explore. We really appreciate you all being here. We really appreciate you all sharing this. This is exactly the type of discussion that we want to have, and this is why we're having this forum the way it is. And thank you very much, Stuart.
There are no further people in the queue.
Okay, then we are moving right along to topic track categorization. So kind of like the last sort of discussion we had, right? I just, we just want to hear whether you think that as it stands with the 9 topics, and I actually would like to sort of tentatively even think about the 2 topics that that Jen had brought up, one being that missing data penalty, and then the second being related to thinking about sort of missing it. Anyways, so thinking about related to reminders on data submission. So to me, both of those fall into that track 2 topic area. They will require that discussion They will require detailed discussion with you all, and it's not at the urgency level that would mean that it would benefit from that streamlined track one process. But feel free to share if you feel differently. That's what I want to hear. And then same thing for the 9 that are currently listed. As we have discussed, the first 5 there are in track 1, and then the next 4 are in track 2. Please let us know how you feel about that kind of categorization, and whether you think that anything should be changed. Excited.
Okay, Dinesh, is this your last slide for today?
Yeah, this will be the last slide for today. This is going to sort of be the final. Oh, let's hold on for about 5 minutes, a couple minutes, just to give people some time to think, in case anybody would like to share anything.
While we hold, I definitely appreciate everyone's participation in this first workshop. I went ahead and decided to notate all the speakers' questions that were done during the meeting. So I'm going to have a very detailed kind of questions from everyone that spoke, and also the entities that provided feedback. So I will connect with my team to figure out if that's something we want to share to our fellow stakeholders. But if not, we will do our best to keep those questions and the discussion questions available. But we want to go over the next steps, because the next steps we want to share another format in which you could participate in written questions. So if you have time for the next week for you and your organization to develop questions or answers to our questions from our comment template. So I don't see any questions in queue, but I will go ahead. If you would like, Dinesh, I do see one question that just came in around now. Would you like to go ahead and it's not a question, actually, it's just a statement. So we can go ahead and proceed. Okay.
Let's hold on till 11:50, and also Glenn, if you'd like to raise your hand and sort of share what your comment was, sort of happy to hear that too. But otherwise, let's hold till 11:50 before we sort of move on to the next steps, if that's okay. Thank you.
Hey, Dinesh, can you hear me?
Loud and clear, Glenn.
Thanks. So this is just a reiteration of what I had mentioned earlier. I think there is some real value with multiple changes that have been made in the market, the settlement timeline, as I think it was Jennifer mentioned, the SQMD annual attestation and affirmation activities, that there may not be a need for meter data penalties in from the rules of conduct, and especially if for any major ones we're requesting FERC relief in the waiver. So I think that's why it would be good to see what penalties have been issued by the ISO. And I think in part we could look at least part of this review of eliminating some or not all the rules of conduct, at least the penalties around common activities that aren't really nefarious or a real example of bad market behavior.
Glenn, thank you for your comment there. So I would welcome, given that we're running a little short on time, I would welcome if you could sort of give a little bit more, not just context, but just, sort of kind of framing and sort of thinking about what those implications would be if we were to get rid of part or total of the ROC, and actually even what parts of the ROC you would even want to consider there. I think for me personally, it's a little bit of a far stretch to say that we should get rid of it. I do have concerns relating to, if we have no penalties, we haven't had any, we have had fewer issues since having the rules of conduct, but I would also kind of attribute some of that to the rules of conduct themselves, and I'd worry if we were to take it away that we would reemerge into a landscape where we have issues. But I mean, feel free to add those clarifications in the written comments. It's definitely something that we would like to look at and see, and hope to hear more.
You bet.
Okay. With that, let's move on to the next steps. Unless, is there anyone in the phone queue that we're missing? Candace?
No, no one's in the queue.
Okay, thank you very much. I think with that, let's move on to the next step.
Thank you, Dinesh. So for today's next steps for this initiative, I wanted to share with everyone that we do have the comments that are going to be due on the 15th. I provided this calendar visual for those stakeholders who would like to see how our timeline looks. So we have our meeting that just finished today, and we have like about 7 days, business days to allow us to give comments for this workshop discussion. And those questions are already available right now, so you can view them while you log into your comment template for your organization. And then next, we do have a planned of publishing the straw proposal on the 5th. So it'll be right after 4th of July. It will be available for that week, and then we will have that meeting on the 13th. So it will be that stakeholder call. That will be a virtual call, hopefully. We'll give you a notice ahead of time with that meeting, but at this time we are hosting mostly virtual during the summer times, but we'll keep everyone updated with the ISO daily briefings. And if there's no questions, we will go ahead and also invite you to go ahead and look at the reference webpage for this stakeholder initiative. And any questions that are very related to our stakeholder process, feel free to email myself or the ISO stakeholder affairs at kaiso.com. We will make sure our best to communicate back to you any of the discussion, as this workshop was very successful. And we appreciate about 26 individuals have spoken up today. So I kept track of that, and that's an impressive number for today's workshop. And thanks so much for Dinesh and David, Uma, who have participated in today's workshop and providing valuable information to our audience today. So at this time, I will go ahead and invite anyone else for any last minute questions, but if not, we'll hand it back to our event producer to close this meeting. Thanks, everyone.
That concludes our conference. Thank you for using event services. You may now disconnect.